The rain fell hard on the small cemetery outside Copper Ridge, turning the red dirt into thick mud. Elena Rodriguez stood perfectly still beside the fresh grave, watching water drip from the brim of her worn hat. The wooden headstone was simple, carved with just a name and 2 dates that felt too close together. Her younger brother Miguel had been only 22 when the bullet found him during that terrible fight near the Mexican border. She didn't cry anymore. The tears had dried up weeks ago, replaced by something harder and colder. The same something that had kept her standing when she found their family ranch burned to nothing but blackened timber and ash. The same thing that had carried her through the long nights searching for her missing fiancé Carlos, following cold trails that led nowhere. "Miss Rodriguez?" Sheriff Wilson's voice cut through the rain. "You sure about this decision?" Elena turned to look at the older man. His weathered face showed concern, the kind that came from watching too many people make choices they might regret. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind and nodded. "I'm sure, Sheriff. More sure than I've ever been about anything." Wilson shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. "It ain't that I doubt your abilities, miss. You proved yourself plenty when you tracked down the Henderson cattle thieves. And Lord knows you can outshoot most men in this territory. But being a deputy, that's different. That's putting yourself in harm's way every single day." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Harm's way? Sheriff, harm already found me. It burned down my home. It killed my brother. It took Carlos from me. I'm not running from danger anymore. I'm going to meet it head on." She knelt down and placed a handful of desert wildflowers on Miguel's grave. The purple blooms looked small and fragile against the dark earth, but they would survive. Desert flowers always did, no matter how harsh the conditions. "I made him a promise," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Right here, right now. I swore I'd keep fighting no matter what comes my way. I won't let anyone else I care about suffer because I wasn't strong enough to protect them." The sheriff watched her stand and brush the mud from her knees. Elena had always been different from other women in the territory. Even before the tragedy, she could ride better than most cowboys, shoot straighter than half the men in town, and had a spine made of iron. But something had changed in her after the attacks. The softness was gone, replaced by sharp edges that warned people to keep their distance. "The town council won't like it," Wilson said. "They're already talking about how improper it is having a woman wear a badge." "Let them talk." Elena's voice was steady as stone. "I don't care what they think. I care about results." As they walked back toward town, Wilson couldn't help but notice how she moved. Every step was purposeful, her hand never straying far from the gun on her hip. She watched everything the way a wolf watches for threats. It was impressive, but it also worried him. A person could build walls so high that they forgot how to let anyone in. The main street of Copper Ridge stretched out before them, lined with wooden buildings that had weathered countless desert storms. The saloon was already busy despite the early hour, and the general store had a steady stream of customers. It was a growing town, full of people chasing dreams of silver strikes and cattle fortunes. But it was also a dangerous place, where disputes were often settled with gunpowder rather than words. "Your first assignment," Wilson said, stopping outside the jail, "is going to be tracking down the gang that hit the Riverside Ranch last week. 3 men, maybe 4. They made off with a dozen head of cattle and shot the foreman when he tried to stop them." Elena nodded, already thinking through the logistics. "Any witnesses? Trail signs?" "The foreman lived long enough to give us a description. Said one of them had a distinctive scar across his left cheek, and they headed north toward the canyon country." The canyon country. Elena knew those red rock formations well. She and Miguel used to explore them as children, following ancient paths that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. The thought of riding those trails without him sent a sharp pain through her chest, but she pushed it down. "I'll need supplies for a week, maybe more," she said. "And a fresh horse. My mare's getting old for long pursuits." Wilson studied her face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. He found none. "Elena, I have to ask, are you doing this for justice or for revenge?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Elena considered it seriously because Sheriff Wilson deserved an honest answer. He'd been kind to her family, and he was taking a real risk by making her his deputy. "Maybe a little of both," she admitted. "But does it matter as long as the job gets done right?" "It matters," Wilson said gently. "Revenge has a way of eating people up from the inside. Justice, that's different. That's about making things right for everyone, not just settling personal scores. Elena looked back toward the cemetery, though it was hidden now by buildings and distance. Miguel was the gentle one in our family. He always saw the best in people, always believed things would work out fair in the end. But believing in fairness didn't save him when those bullets started flying. She turned back to face Wilson, and he saw something in her eyes that made him take a step back. It wasn't madness or wild grief. It was something colder and more determined. "I'll do the job right, Sheriff. I'll follow the law and bring them in alive if possible. But I won't make the mistake of thinking the world is fair, or that good intentions are enough to protect the people I care about. From now on, I trust in preparation, skill, and the willingness to do whatever needs doing." That night, Elena sat in her small room above the seamstress shop, cleaning her weapons and planning her pursuit. The rain had stopped, but she could still hear water dripping from the eaves. On the small table beside her bed lay a photograph of her family, taken just 2 years earlier. Her parents had died of fever the previous winter, but in the picture they all looked so happy, so certain that the future held good things. She picked up the photograph and studied Miguel's young face. He'd been so excited about working the ranch, about the plans they'd made to expand the herd and maybe build a proper house to replace the old adobe cabin. All those dreams were buried now along with his body. "I'll keep fighting," she whispered to the photograph. "No matter what it costs me, no matter how hard it gets. I swear it on your grave, Miguel. I won't let them win." Outside her window, the desert night was full of sounds. Coyotes calling to each other across the darkness, the wind moving through the sagebrush, the distant sound of music from the saloon. It was a wild, unforgiving land that demanded strength from anyone who wanted to survive in it. Elena blew out the lamp and settled back on her narrow bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Tomorrow she would begin her new life as a deputy, hunting dangerous men through dangerous country. She would face whatever came with determination and skill, building walls around her heart high enough to keep out any more pain. She had no way of knowing that somewhere out in those red rock canyons, another soul was nursing wounds just as deep as hers, or that their paths would cross in ways that would change everything she thought she knew about strength and survival. 3 months had passed since Elena pinned the deputy's badge to her vest, and the people of Copper Ridge were still getting used to the idea of a woman enforcing the law. Some folks whispered behind her back, saying it wasn't natural or proper. Others had learned to respect the quiet intensity she brought to every job. She'd already tracked down 2 groups of cattle rustlers, recovered stolen property from a gang of drifters, and faced down 3 armed men in the saloon without firing a single shot. Her reputation was growing throughout the territory, and Sheriff Wilson couldn't have been more pleased with his choice. But Elena noticed things that others missed, small things that didn't quite add up. It started with the Martinez family. Old Pedro Martinez had been struggling to keep his small farm running after his sons moved away to seek their fortunes in California. Elena remembered seeing him in town, his face lined with worry as he counted out coins at the general store, trying to make his meager savings stretch another month. Then one morning, Pedro showed up in town with a cart full of vegetables to sell, his eyes bright with relief instead of worry. When curious neighbors asked about his sudden good fortune, he just shrugged and said he'd found what he needed. Elena made a point of riding out to check on him. She found neat piles of fence posts stacked beside his property, enough quality lumber to repair his broken corrals. Pedro swore he didn't know where they'd come from, and his genuine confusion convinced her he was telling the truth. "Must be an angel watching over me," he told her with a gap-toothed smile. "My Maria always said the desert spirits look after folks who try to do right." Similar mysteries began popping up all around the area. The widow Chen found her well cleaned and deepened overnight, with fresh, sweet water flowing where only muddy seepage had been before. The school teacher discovered a stack of books outside the schoolhouse one morning, along with writing supplies and slates for the children. Each time, the beneficiaries were people who truly needed help, and each time no one claimed credit for the good deed. Elena's curiosity grew stronger with each incident. She started paying closer attention to tracks around these locations, but what she found only deepened the puzzle. Sometimes she'd discover boot prints that looked like they belonged to a man of average size. Other times she'd find the unmistakable marks of moccasins, made in the traditional Apache style, but showing unusual wear patterns, as if the person wearing them spent more time walking on rocks than soft ground. The most puzzling discovery came after the incident with the injured horses. A wild Mustang had gotten tangled in old barbed wire near the creek, cutting itself badly in its struggle to break free. Tom Bradley, who ran the livery stable, had been planning to put the animal down rather than watch it suffer. But when Elena rode out to check on the situation, she found the horse standing calmly in the shade, its wounds cleaned and dressed with what looked like native healing plants. The barbed wire had been carefully removed and coiled up, placed far from where any other animal might encounter it. "Strangest thing I ever seen," Bradley told her, scratching his gray head. "That horse was near dead yesterday. Today it's acting like nothing happened. And look here at these tracks." Elena knelt to examine the ground around where the horse had been treated. The tracks told an interesting story. Boot prints showed someone had approached carefully, spent considerable time working with the animal, then moved away toward the rocky ground where the trail vanished. But mixed in with the boot prints were other marks, ones that made her pulse quicken. They were paw prints, but larger than any dog and with claw marks that suggested a wild animal. Wolf prints, she realized. But wolves had been hunted out of this area years ago, driven away by ranchers protecting their livestock. Elena followed the trail as far as she could, but it disappeared into the red rock country north of town. That night, she sat on her porch studying a map of the local area, trying to piece together a pattern from all these strange occurrences. The canyon country stretched for miles beyond the settled areas, a maze of stone formations that had been carved by wind and water over countless centuries. It was beautiful but dangerous territory, full of dead-end passages and hidden drop-offs that could trap an unwary traveler. The Apache had considered some of those canyons sacred, though most of the local tribes had been moved to reservations years earlier. Elena had heard stories, of course. Every frontier town had its share of tall tales and mysterious legends. But lately, the stories seemed to be changing, becoming more specific and consistent. People talked about glimpsing a figure moving through the rocks at dawn or dusk, always too far away to see clearly. Travelers reported finding water left at dry camping spots, or discovering that dangerous rock slides had been cleared from commonly used trails. Children claimed to have seen wolves in the distance, though their parents dismissed such sightings as imagination. The name that kept coming up in whispered conversations was Ghost Walker. According to the stories, he was an Apache warrior who'd been cast out from his tribe for reasons no one could agree on. Some said he'd committed a terrible crime. Others claimed he'd broken tribal law by refusing to fight. A few insisted he'd been cursed by spirits and could no longer live among his people. Elena didn't put much stock in ghost stories, but she believed in evidence. And the evidence suggested that someone was living in those canyons, someone with considerable skill in moving unseen and knowledge of traditional healing practices. Her chance to learn more came when she was tracking a group of horse thieves who'd struck the Patterson Ranch. The trail led north toward the canyon country, following an ancient path that wound between towering stone walls. Elena had been riding since before dawn, and the summer heat was beginning to take its toll on both her and her horse. She stopped to rest in the shade of an overhanging rock, studying the tracks that were becoming harder to follow on the stone ground. That's when she noticed something that made her reach for her gun. Mixed in with the hoofprints of the stolen horses were those same unusual moccasin tracks she'd been seeing around town. Someone was following the horse thieves just as she was. As the afternoon wore on, Elena found more signs of this mysterious pursuer. Broken twigs arranged in patterns that might have been trail markers. Stones stacked in small cairns at points where the path branched. Someone who knew this country intimately was moving parallel to her route, staying just out of sight. The trail led deeper into the canyon system, following watercourses that were mostly dry but showed signs of recent flow. Elena's horse picked its way carefully across loose stones and around prickly pear cactus that seemed to grow from solid rock. As the sun began to sink toward the western rim of the canyon, Elena heard something that made her pull up short. It was the sound of voices, but not the rough laughter of the men she was pursuing. This was different. Quieter. More controlled. She dismounted and led her horse forward carefully, using every bit of cover the rocky terrain provided. The voices grew clearer as she approached a bend in the canyon wall. One voice belonged to a man she didn't recognize, speaking in accented English with what sounded like barely controlled anger. "You had no right to interfere," the stranger was saying. "These matters don't concern you anymore." The response came in a voice so quiet Elena had to strain to hear it. "All suffering concerns me, brother. You know this. I know that you were cast out. I know that you chose the white man's path over your own people's survival. Don't call me brother when you've forgotten what that word means." Elena eased closer to the edge of the rock face and peered around it carefully. Below in a small clearing, she could see 4 men standing near the stolen horses. 3 of them were clearly the thieves she'd been tracking. But the 4th was different. He was Apache, dressed in traditional clothing but bearing himself with the careful stillness of someone accustomed to danger. Even from a distance, she could see old scars crossing his arms and chest, the kind that spoke of battles fought and survived. But what struck her most was his calm demeanor as he faced the 3 armed thieves. He showed no fear, no aggression, just a quiet certainty that made Elena wonder if the stories about Ghostwalker might be more than legend after all. The confrontation below was building toward violence, and Elena had to make a choice. She could wait and let events play out naturally, or she could intervene as a law officer should. Either way, she was about to get answers to questions that had been puzzling her for months. Elena knew she had to act fast. The tension in the clearing below was building toward violence, and while she didn't yet understand what was happening, she could see that the Apache man was outnumbered 3-1. She made her decision quickly, the way she'd learned to do in dangerous situations, leading her horse to a secure spot behind some boulders. She worked her way down the steep canyon wall, using hand and footholds that seemed almost invisible until she needed them. The descent was treacherous, but Elena had grown up climbing these red rocks with Miguel. Her boots found purchase on narrow ledges, and her fingers gripped stone protrusions that had been carved by centuries of wind and rain. She moved as quietly as possible, but small pebbles still scattered down the cliff face with each step. By the time she reached the canyon floor, the confrontation had escalated. One of the thieves had drawn his gun, and the Apache man had stepped back toward a cluster of large boulders, clearly preparing for a fight he didn't want but wouldn't run from. "That's enough," Elena called out, stepping into the clearing with her own weapon drawn. "Nobody needs to die today." The 3 thieves spun toward her, surprised by her sudden appearance. The Apache man's dark eyes met hers for just a moment, and she saw something there that caught her off guard. Not gratitude for her intervention, but a kind of resigned acceptance, as if he'd been expecting this moment for a long time. "Well, well," said the man who seemed to be the leader of the thieves. "If it ain't the lady deputy we've been hearing about. Heard you were tough, but you're still just 1 person against 3. Elena kept her gun steady, trained on the center of the group. "Actually, it looks like 1 person against 4. But I'm not here for a fight. I'm here to arrest you for stealing Patterson's horses and return the animals to their rightful owner." The leader laughed, but there was nervousness in the sound. "You think this savage is gonna help you? He ain't nothing but a outcast, not welcome nowhere." His own people threw him out like garbage. The Apache man spoke quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still desert air. The horses were taken by force from people who needed them for their livelihood. That makes it wrong, no matter who does it or why. Listen to him, the leader sneered, talking about right and wrong like he's some kind of judge. You know what they say about him in the Pueblos? They say he's cursed, say he brings bad luck to everyone he meets. Elena kept her attention divided between the thieves and the stranger, trying to read the situation. The Apache man didn't seem bothered by the insults, but she could see tension in the way he held his shoulders, the careful positioning of his feet that suggested he was ready to move fast if necessary. "I don't care about Pueblo gossip," Elena said firmly. "I care about the law. You men are under arrest for horse theft. You can come with me peacefully, or we can do this the hard way." The leader's eyes darted between Elena and the Apache man, calculating odds. "Tell you what, deputy. You let us ride out of here with these horses and we'll pretend we never saw you. Nobody gets hurt and you can tell folks you never found us." "That's not how this works," Elena replied. "The horses go back to their owner. You 3 come back to town with me to face trial. That's the only deal I'm offering." What happened next came so fast that Elena barely had time to react. The leader drew his gun while diving for cover behind one of the stolen horses. His 2 companions scattered in different directions, also reaching for their weapons. Elena dropped into a crouch and fired at the leader, her shot scoring the boulder he ducked behind. She rolled sideways to avoid return fire, using the rocky terrain for cover just as the Apache man had planned to do. But the stranger surprised her. Instead of fleeing or taking cover, he moved directly toward the danger. Elena watched in amazement as he seemed to flow around the panicked horses, calming them with touches and quiet sounds even while bullets flew past his head. One of the thieves got off a clean shot that should have taken him down, but somehow he wasn't where the bullet went. He moved like water, like wind, always just out of reach of the violence swirling around him. Elena found herself fighting alongside someone she'd never met, their movements complementing each other, as if they'd planned the coordination in advance. When she drove one thief toward the eastern wall of the canyon, the Apache man was already positioned to cut off his escape. When he forced another gunman to take cover behind a fallen log, Elena had a clear shot from her new position. The fight was over in less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. 2 of the thieves were wounded but alive. The third had thrown down his gun and surrendered when he realized he was outmaneuvered. The stolen horses stood quietly nearby, somehow unharmed despite the chaos that had erupted around them. Elena kept her gun trained on the prisoners while she tried to catch her breath. Her heart was pounding, not just from the fight but from the realization of how smoothly she and the stranger had worked together. "You hurt?" she called out to him. The Apache man was checking on the horses, running his hands along their legs and flanks to make sure they hadn't been injured by stray bullets. "I am well," he replied without looking up. The animals were frightened but not harmed. Elena studied him more carefully now that the immediate danger had passed. He was probably in his 30s, though the desert sun made it hard to tell for certain. His black hair was long and braided with small pieces of turquoise and silver. The scars she'd noticed from a distance were more extensive up close, telling stories of violence that went beyond ordinary fights. But what struck her most were his eyes. They held depths of experience that reminded her uncomfortably of what she saw in her own mirror each morning. This was someone who had seen too much pain and carried too many losses. "I need to get these men back to town," she said, gesturing toward the prisoners. "There's a reward posted for their capture, and the Patterson family needs their horses returned." The Apache man nodded and stepped back, clearly preparing to disappear back into the canyon system. But Elena found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "Wait," she said. "I don't even know your name." He paused, studying her face with those dark, unreadable eyes. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice soft but clear. "I am called Kachina by my people. It means sacred dancer in the old language, though sacred is not a word many would use for me now." Elena felt something stir in her chest, a curiosity she hadn't experienced in months. "The people in town call you Ghost Walker. They say you live alone in the canyons." "People say many things," Kachina replied. "Most of them are true enough." He turned to go, but Elena spoke again. "Those good deeds around town. The help that shows up when people need it most. That's you, isn't it?" Kachina stopped but didn't turn back toward her. "The desert is harsh, but it provides for those who know how to see its gifts. Sometimes sharing those gifts is the only way to remember that there is still good in the world. Why were you following these horse thieves?" Now he did turn, and Elena saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. It was pain, old and deep and carefully controlled, because taking what belongs to others is wrong no matter what reasons a person might have, because choosing to do harm when you could choose to heal is a betrayal of everything that makes us human. The words hung in the desert air between them, heavy with meanings Elena didn't fully understand yet. She wanted to ask more questions, to understand what had driven this man into exile and why he continued to help people who probably feared him. But her prisoners were getting restless, and the sun was beginning to sink toward the canyon rim. She had duties to perform, responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. "Maybe I'll see you around," she said, immediately feeling foolish for the casual words. Kachina looked at her for a long moment, and Elena had the strangest feeling that he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. Finally, he nodded once. "The desert shows us many things if we have eyes to see them," he said. "Some meetings happen for reasons we don't understand until much later." Then he melted back into the rocky landscape with the same fluid grace he'd shown during the fight, leaving Elena alone with her prisoners and more questions than answers. As she loaded the wounded thieves onto their own horses and prepared for the long ride back to town, Elena found herself looking over her shoulder toward the red rocks where Kachina had disappeared. She had the strange feeling that their paths would cross again, and that when they did, her carefully ordered world might never be the same. Elena couldn't stop thinking about Kachina. 3 days had passed since their encounter in the canyon, but his words kept echoing in her mind. The way he moved, the calm certainty in his voice, the pain she'd glimpsed in his dark eyes, it all stayed with her as she went about her daily duties in town. She found herself riding the edges of the canyon country more often, telling herself she was just being thorough in her patrols. But deep down, she knew she was hoping for another glimpse of the mysterious Apache who had fought beside her with such unexpected skill. On the fourth day, her curiosity finally overcame her professional caution. Elena packed extra supplies in her saddlebags and told Sheriff Wilson she was investigating reports of rustlers in the northern canyons. It wasn't entirely a lie. There had been some minor livestock missing from the Morrison spread, though nothing that seemed urgent. The morning was clear and cool, perfect weather for exploring the Red Rock country. Elena followed the same path she'd taken when pursuing the horse thieves, but this time she branched off onto smaller trails that led deeper into the maze of stone formations. She'd been riding for about 2 hours when she noticed something unusual. Near a small seep spring, someone had built a careful arrangement of stones that formed a natural windbreak. The construction was so skillful that it looked almost like part of the landscape, but Elena's trained eye caught the subtle signs of human work. Dismounting, she examined the area more closely. The ground around the spring showed signs of regular use, but not the kind of heavy traffic that would indicate a popular camping spot. Instead, she found evidence of someone who visited regularly but took great care to leave minimal traces. Hidden among the rocks, she discovered small bundles of herbs hanging in the shade to dry. Some she recognized as plants used by local Mexican families for cooking and medicine. Others were unfamiliar, with distinctive scents that suggested they came from higher elevations or more remote areas. Elena was so absorbed in her investigation that she almost missed the soft sound of approaching footsteps. Her hand moved instinctively to her gun, but she didn't draw it when she recognized the figure emerging from behind a cluster of tall stones. Kachina moved toward her with that same fluid grace she remembered, but now she could see he was carrying something. In his arms was a young deer, probably not more than a few months old, with a crude splint bound to its right hind leg. "You're far from town, Deputy," he said, settling the deer carefully in the shade near the spring. "Did you come looking for more horse thieves or for something else?" Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I was investigating some missing livestock," she said, then added more honestly, "and I was curious about you." Kachina nodded as if he'd expected as much. He knelt beside the young deer, checking the splint with gentle hands while the animal watched him with trusting eyes. Curiosity can be dangerous in the desert. It can lead people into places they're not prepared to handle. "I can handle myself," Elena said, bristling slightly at what sounded like condescension. "I saw that in the canyon," Kachina replied calmly. "You fight well and think quickly under pressure. But there are different kinds of strength and different kinds of preparation." He gestured toward the deer, which was now drinking from the spring. This one was caught in an old trap, probably set by a trapper who forgot to check it regularly. The bone was broken but not beyond healing. It just needed someone to notice the injury and care enough to help. Elena watched him work with the animal, noting the expertise in his movements. "You know a lot about healing." "I know about breaking and therefore about mending," Kachina said quietly. The two go together more often than people realize. Something in his tone made Elena look at him more carefully. In the clear morning light, she could see more details of the scars that marked his arms and torso. Some looked like old bullet wounds. Others might have been from knives or arrowheads. But there were marks that puzzled her, patterns that didn't match any weapon she could identify. "What happened to you?" she asked, then immediately regretted the direct question. "I'm sorry. That's not my business." Kachina was quiet for so long that Elena thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft she had to lean closer to hear him. "I was born into the Chiricahua band, in the time when the white soldiers were pushing all the Apache people onto reservations. My father was a war leader who believed that fighting was the only way to keep our freedom. My mother was a medicine woman who taught me that healing and harming are both choices, and that the choice we make defines who we are." He stood and moved to check on some of the hanging herbs, his back turned to Elena as he continued. "When I came of age, the soldiers captured many of our people and took them far away to a place called Florida. Those of us who remained faced an impossible choice: surrender and lose everything we had ever known, or keep fighting a war we could never win. Elena found herself holding her breath, understanding that she was hearing something Kachina had probably never told anyone else. My father chose to keep fighting. He led raids against the white settlements, taking cattle and horses, sometimes killing people who tried to stop him. He said it was justice for what had been done to our people. He said the white men had started the war, and we were just finishing it. Kachina turned back toward her, and Elena saw that his eyes held a pain so deep it made her own losses feel small by comparison. I went on 3 raids with him. I saw what we did to people who had families, who had children, who were just trying to survive in a hard land the same as we were. On the 3rd raid, we attacked a small ranch where a family was living peacefully. The father tried to protect his wife and children, and my father killed him. Elena's throat felt tight. She could see where this story was heading, and she understood now why Kachina lived alone in the desert. I watched that man die, and I saw his family's grief, and I realized that we had become the same as the soldiers who had destroyed our villages. We were creating the same pain we had suffered, just wearing different faces. His voice grew even quieter. I told my father I wouldn't participate in any more raids. I said I would fight soldiers if they came for us, but I wouldn't attack innocent people. What did he do? He cast me out, Kachina said simply. In front of the whole band, he declared that I was no longer his son, no longer Apache, no longer welcome among the people. He said I had become weak, corrupted by white man's thinking. Some of the warriors wanted to kill me as a traitor, but my mother intervened. She convinced them to let me leave alive, but I could never return. Elena felt something crack open inside her chest. How long ago was this? 7 years. I've been alone in these canyons ever since, trying to find a way to live that honors what my mother taught me about healing, instead of what my father believed about war. The young deer had finished drinking and was now resting comfortably in the shade, its injured leg stretched out carefully. Elena looked at it, then at the drying herbs, then at Kachina's scarred hands, and began to understand the full picture. The good deeds around town, she said. The help that appears when people need it most. You're trying to balance the scales, aren't you? Trying to heal as much as you once helped to harm. Kachina nodded slowly. It's not enough. It can never be enough. But it's the only way I know to live with what I've done and what I failed to prevent. Elena thought about her own losses, her own anger, her own desire for justice or revenge. She thought about the wall she'd built around her heart and the promise she'd made at Miguel's grave to keep fighting no matter what. The people who benefit from your help, she said. Do they know where it comes from? No, and it's better that way. They would refuse aid from someone like me, someone who has blood on his hands and shame in his past. It's easier for everyone if I remain a ghost story, a mystery they don't have to think about too hard. Elena studied his face, seeing the loneliness there alongside the pain. That must be incredibly difficult, helping people who would fear you if they knew the truth. Fear is something I understand, Kachina said. I feared what I was becoming when I rode with the raiders. I feared my father's anger when I chose a different path. I feared dying alone in the desert after my people cast me out. But the fear of living without purpose, without meaning, without some way to make amends for past mistakes, that fear was stronger than all the others. The sun was climbing higher now, and Elena knew she should be getting back to town. But she found herself reluctant to leave this hidden place where Kachina had shared something so deeply personal with her. Thank you, she said finally, for trusting me with your story. You asked an honest question, Kachina replied. You deserved an honest answer, but now you carry knowledge that could be dangerous. The people in town wouldn't understand. If they knew where their mysterious help was really coming from, they won't hear it from me, Elena said firmly. I give you my word on that. Kachina looked at her for a long moment, and she had the feeling he was measuring something in her character, weighing her sincerity against past betrayals he'd experienced. You have your own ghosts, he said finally, your own losses that drive you to fight battles that may not be worth winning. I can see it in how you carry yourself, how you watch the world around you for threats. The meetings became a pattern, though neither Elena nor Kachina spoke about it directly. Every few days, Elena would find herself patrolling the northern canyons, and somehow their paths would cross near the hidden spring, or along one of the ancient trails that wound through the red rock formations. At first, their conversations were brief and cautious. Elena would ask about his work with injured animals or mention news from town that might interest him. Kachina would share knowledge about the desert, pointing out plants she'd never noticed or showing her signs that revealed which animals had passed by and when. But gradually, as the weeks passed, their talks grew longer and more personal. Elena found herself looking forward to these encounters more than anything else in her carefully structured life. There was something about Kachina's quiet presence that made her feel less alone, less burdened by the weight of responsibilities she'd taken on. One evening in late autumn, when the desert air had turned cool and the first stars were appearing in the purple sky, Elena came upon Kachina's campsite just as he was building a small fire. The young deer she'd seen him treating had grown stronger and was now able to move around on its own, though it still stayed close to the man who had saved its life. "Mind if I join you?" Elena asked, dismounting from her horse. "I brought coffee and some of that cornbread from Rose's kitchen." Kachina looked up from arranging dry wood and nodded toward a flat stone that would serve as a seat. "Company is always welcome at my fire, though I should warn you that sharing a meal with an outcast might damage your reputation in town." "Let me worry about my reputation," Elena said, settling onto the stone and pulling supplies from her saddlebags. "Besides, I think I'm getting a reputation as someone who does things her own way, regardless of what people think." As they prepared their simple meal together, Elena found herself watching Kachina's movements with growing fascination. Everything he did seemed deliberate and graceful, from the way he fed small twigs to the flames to how he arranged the coffee pot to heat evenly. There was no wasted motion, no hurried gestures, just the calm efficiency of someone completely at peace with his surroundings. "You do everything like it's a ceremony," she observed, accepting a cup of coffee that had been brewed to perfection. "My mother taught me that all actions have meaning if we choose to see it," Kachina replied, settling across the fire from her. "The way we prepare food, tend animals, even how we sit and breathe, these things reflect who we are and what we value. If we rush through life without awareness, we miss most of what makes it worth living." Elena sipped her coffee and considered this idea. Her own life had become a series of urgent tasks and pressing responsibilities, each day planned out with military precision. When had she last taken time to simply sit and watch the stars emerge in the evening sky? "Tell me about your mother," she said. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." Kachina's expression softened in the firelight. "She was the strongest person I ever knew. When the soldiers came to force our people onto the reservation, she watched her entire world disappear, but never lost her faith that life still held meaning and beauty. Even after my father cast me out, she found ways to send messages to let me know she hadn't forgotten me." "Does she know what you're doing now? The healing work, the help you give to people in town?" "She died 2 winters ago," Kachina said quietly. "But I think she would understand. She always believed that medicine, true medicine, isn't just about treating wounds or sickness. It's about treating the broken connections between people, the places where trust and understanding have been damaged." Elena felt a familiar ache in her chest, the pain that always came when she thought about losing people she cared about. "I'm sorry for your loss. Losing someone who understands us is one of the hardest things we face." "You speak from experience," Kachina observed. "Your brother, the one whose grave you visit, he understood you in ways others didn't?" Elena was startled by his perceptiveness, then remembered that in a town the size of Copper Ridge, everyone's business became common knowledge eventually. "Miguel was the only family I had left after our parents died. He was younger than me, but somehow he always seemed wiser, more patient, better at seeing the good in people." She stared into the flames, watching them dance and flicker in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. "I was always the fighter in our family, the one who faced down threats and solved problems with determination and stubbornness. Miguel was the peacemaker, the one who could calm angry neighbors or settle disputes with gentle words instead of harsh ones. And now you try to be both," Kachina said softly. "The fighter and the peacemaker, the protector and the healer. That's a heavy burden for one person to carry." Elena looked up at him sharply. "How do you know that?" "Because I see how you move through the world. Like someone who's trying to fill the space left by another person, trying to be everything they were while still being everything you are." Kachina added another stick to the fire, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. "It's admirable, but it's also exhausting. No one person can be everything to everyone. What choice do I have?" Elena's voice came out more defensive than she'd intended. "The people in town depend on me to keep them safe. If I don't do the job, who will?" "That's not what I meant," Kachina said gently. I meant that you've built walls so high around your heart that you can't let anyone else share the load. You've convinced yourself that needing help is the same as weakness, that trusting others is too dangerous because they might be taken away. Elena felt something hot and uncomfortable rise in her throat. That's not... When did you last let someone take care of you? Kachina asked, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. When did you last admit that you were tired or scared or unsure about something? When did you last ask for help instead of insisting you could handle everything alone? The questions hit Elena like physical blows. She wanted to argue, to deny what he was saying, but the words wouldn't come, because he was right and they both knew it. After Miguel died, she said finally, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames, I made a promise. I swore I'd be strong enough to protect everyone I cared about, strong enough to never feel helpless again. And in trying to become that strong, you've made yourself alone, Kachina said. Strength that isolates us from others isn't really strength at all. It's fear wearing a disguise. Elena felt tears threatening and fought them back with the same determination she brought to every other challenge. Fear keeps people alive. Trust gets them killed. Sometimes, Kachina agreed. But fear can also kill in its own way. It can kill joy, connection, the possibility of finding meaning beyond just survival. They sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the night sounds of the desert. An owl called from somewhere in the rocks above them. A coyote answered from a distant ridge. The fire burned steadily between them, creating a small circle of warmth and light in the vast darkness. You asked about my mother, Kachina said eventually. Would you like to hear something she used to tell me when I was struggling with difficult choices? Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. She said that every person carries two wolves inside them. One wolf is fed by anger, fear, resentment, and the need to control everything around us. The other wolf is fed by love, trust, compassion, and the willingness to be vulnerable enough to connect with others. Kachina looked directly at Elena across the flames. The wolf that grows strongest is the one we choose to feed. What if the world is too dangerous for the second wolf? Elena asked. What if trusting others just gives them the power to hurt us? Then we have to decide whether a life without trust, without connection, without the possibility of love is really worth protecting, Kachina replied. My father fed the first wolf so completely that it consumed everything else. His anger and fear turned him into someone who could only see enemies, only respond with violence. In the end, that wolf devoured even his relationship with his own son. Elena thought about the walls she'd built around her heart, the armor of determination and independence that kept everyone at a safe distance. It had protected her from further loss, but what else had it protected her from? I don't know how to be different, she admitted. This is who I've had to become to survive. You don't have to change all at once, Kachina said gently. Healing happens slowly, one small choice at a time. The same way a broken bone mends or a damaged heart learns to beat steadily again. As the evening grew later, their conversation turned to easier topics. Kachina told her stories about the wildlife he'd observed, sharing details about animal behavior that fascinated Elena. She talked about some of the more amusing incidents from her work as a deputy, cases that had ended in laughter rather than violence. But underneath the lighter conversation, Elena was aware of something shifting inside her. The questions Kachina had asked, the gentle challenge to her carefully constructed defenses, had opened doors in her mind that she'd kept locked for months. When it came time to leave, Elena found herself reluctant to return to town, to the small room above the seamstress shop where she lived alone with her memories and her responsibilities. Kachina, she said as she prepared to mount her horse, what you said about feeding the wolves, how do you know which choice feeds which? The ambush came without warning on a gray December morning when the desert wind carried the promise of winter snow. Elena had been tracking a group of cattle rustlers for 3 days, following their trail through increasingly rough country north of the Canyonlands. The tracks led to an area she'd never explored before, a maze of narrow passages and towering stone walls that seemed to swallow sound and light. She should have been more careful. The signs were all there, broken twigs arranged too neatly, horse droppings that were too fresh for the age of the tracks, the unsettling quiet that meant wildlife had been disturbed recently. But Elena's mind was elsewhere, still processing the conversations she'd been having with Kachina, still wrestling with questions about trust and vulnerability that she'd never wanted to consider. The first shot came from above. echoing off the canyon walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it had originated. Elena's horse reared in panic, and she threw herself from the saddle just as a second bullet whined past her head, striking sparks from the stone where she'd been sitting a moment before. 3 men emerged from concealed positions among the rocks, spreading out to surround her with practiced efficiency. Elena recognized the leader immediately. Jake Morrison, a man she'd arrested twice before for various crimes, but who always seemed to slip through the legal system on technicalities. Well, Morrison called out, his rifle trained on Elena's position behind a fallen boulder. If it ain't the famous lady deputy, you've been causing us a lot of trouble lately, interfering with our business. Elena kept her head down as bullets chipped away at her cover. She could hear the other 2 men moving to flank her position, and she knew her situation was desperate. The canyon walls were too steep to climb quickly, and there was no other cover within reach. Nothing personal, deputy, Morrison continued, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. But you've got a reputation for being too stubborn to take hints. Seems like the only way to get you to leave us alone is to make sure you can't cause any more problems. Elena checked her ammunition quickly, 6 rounds left in her pistol, plus the rifle still secured to her panicked horse somewhere among the rocks. Not nearly enough to fight her way out against 3 men with good positions and plenty of cover. That's when she heard it, a sound so subtle she almost missed it. The soft scrape of moccasins against stone, coming from somewhere above and behind her attackers. Her heart jumped with sudden hope, even as her practical mind told her that Kachina couldn't possibly know where she was or that she needed help. But somehow, impossibly, he was there. Elena caught a glimpse of movement among the rocks high above, a shadow that seemed to flow from one position to another without ever being fully visible. The men surrounding her were so focused on their trap that they didn't notice the new presence in their carefully planned ambush. What happened next unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance of violence and precision. Kachina descended the canyon wall in places that should have been impossible to climb, using handholds and footholds that seemed to appear and disappear like magic. He moved without making a sound, closing distance on the nearest gunman with the fluid grace Elena had seen him use with frightened animals. The first attacker went down without firing another shot, taken completely by surprise by someone he never saw coming. The second man heard his partner's cry of alarm and turned to investigate, giving Elena the opening she needed to break from cover and find a better position. But it was Morrison who presented the real danger. The outlaw leader was smarter and more experienced than his companions. When he realized they were under attack from an unexpected source, he adapted quickly, using Elena as bait to draw Kachina into the open. I don't know who you are. Friend? Morrison called out, his voice carrying clearly in the canyon air. But this is between me and the deputy. You back off now and maybe you'll live to see sunset. Elena could see Kachina positioned on a ledge about 30 feet above, perfectly placed to take Morrison down if he had a rifle. But she realized with growing alarm that he wasn't armed with anything more than a knife in his bare hands. He'd come to help her without even taking time to properly equip himself for a fight. Let me go and you can walk away, Elena called to Morrison, trying to buy time while she figured out a plan. You kill a deputy and they'll hunt you across 3 territories. There'll be no place to hide. Morrison laughed, but there was nervous tension in the sound. They have to catch us first, and they have to find your body first. These canyons are full of places where people disappear forever. Elena saw Kachina tense on his ledge, preparing to make a move that would probably get him killed. Morrison's rifle was trained on her position, but he was watching the rocks where he'd glimpsed movement, ready to swing the barrel toward any threat. The thought of Kachina dying because he'd tried to help her sent a surge of desperate strength through Elena's body. Without thinking, she broke from cover and ran directly toward Morrison's position, gambling that his attention would focus on her, long enough to give Kachina the opening he needed. The gamble almost failed. Morrison swung his rifle toward her charging figure and fired, the bullet passing so close to her head that she felt the heat of its passage. But before he could work the lever action for a second shot, Kachina struck like a thunderbolt from above. The 2 men went down in a tangle of limbs, fighting with desperate intensity on the rocky ground. Elena reached them just as Morrison managed to break free and draw his sidearm, the barrel swinging toward Kachina's exposed torso. Elena's shot took Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying among the scattered stones. The outlaw leader fell heavily, clutching his wounded arm and cursing with creative profanity that echoed off the canyon walls. The sudden silence that followed was almost as jarring as the gunfire had been. Elena found herself kneeling beside Kachina, her hands shaking as she checked him for injuries. He had taken several hard blows during the fight, and there was blood on his face from a cut above his left eye. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice coming out rougher than she'd intended. "Can you move everything?" Kachina sat up slowly, wincing as he tested his ribs. "Nothing broken," he said, though Elena could see the pain he was trying to hide. "You?" "I'm fine," Elena replied automatically, then realized it wasn't entirely true. The bullet that had passed so close to her head had left her ears ringing, and she could feel the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving her shaky and nauseated. It took the better part of an hour to secure the 3 prisoners and recover their weapons. Morrison's wound needed attention, and one of the other men had a concussion from his encounter with Kachina. Elena found herself depending heavily on Kachina's medical knowledge as they improvised treatment with the limited supplies available. "We need to get them back to town," Elena said, looking at the injured prisoners with professional concern. "Morrison especially needs a real doctor." Kachina nodded, but Elena could see exhaustion in his movements. The fight had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit, and she suspected his ribs were more damaged than he'd acknowledged. "You should come with us," she said impulsively. "Let Doc Henderson check those ribs. You might have internal bleeding." "I can't go to town," Kachina replied quietly. "You know this." Elena did know, but the knowledge frustrated her more than she could express. Here was someone who had quite literally saved her life, someone whose medical skills surpassed those of many trained doctors, and he couldn't receive basic medical care because of prejudices and fears that had nothing to do with who he really was. "Then let me take care of you," she said. "At least let me clean that cut and make sure you don't have a serious head injury." They made camp in a sheltered alcove while the prisoners rested under careful guard. Elena used water from her canteen and clean cloth from her first aid kit to tend Kachina's wounds, working by the light of a small fire as the desert evening grew cold around them. Her hands trembled as she cleaned the cut above his eye, and she realized it wasn't just from the after effects of combat. There was something deeply intimate about caring for someone who had risked his life for her, something that broke through the walls she'd built around her heart with surprising force. "Why did you come?" she asked as she worked. "How did you even know I was in trouble?" Kachina was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he considered his answer. "I've been watching over you," he said finally. "When you ride alone in dangerous country following dangerous men, it seemed important to make sure you stayed safe." Elena paused in her ministrations, struck by the implications of what he was saying. "You've been following me?"
Watching my back without me knowing it.
"Not following," Kachina corrected gently. "Just aware. The desert speaks to those who know how to listen. It tells us when things are out of balance, when someone we care about is in danger." Elena's hand stilled completely. "Someone you care about?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meanings that neither of them had been willing to acknowledge before. Elena found herself holding her breath, waiting for his response. Kachina reached up slowly and covered her hands with his own, his scarred fingers gentle against her skin. The telegram arrived on a cold January morning, delivered by a nervous young clerk who seemed eager to escape Elena's office as quickly as possible. The message was brief and to the point, signed by Territorial Governor William Bradford himself. "Deputy Rodriguez, your expertise in Northern Canyon territories required for military expedition. Report to Fort Carson immediately to discuss leadership role in Apache pacification campaign. This is not a request. Governor Bradford." Elena read the message 3 times, each reading making the knot in her stomach tighter. She knew what Apache pacification campaign meant in the language of territorial politics. It meant hunting down the remaining free Apache bands and forcing them onto reservations, using whatever level of violence was deemed necessary to achieve compliance. Sheriff Wilson knocked on her office door and entered without waiting for permission, his weathered face creased with concern. "Heard you got word from the governor. That can't be good news, judging by your expression." Elena handed him the telegram and watched his face grow grim as he read. Wilson had been a soldier himself in younger days, and he understood the implications better than most. "They want you to use your knowledge of the canyon country," he said quietly. "Your connections with..." Certain individuals who know those lands well. Elena nodded, unable to trust her voice. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. The territorial government wanted to use her growing reputation as someone who could navigate the Red Rock Maze to hunt down people like Kachina, people who had committed no crime except refusing to surrender their freedom. "What are you going to do?" Wilson asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "This isn't the kind of order you can ignore. Bradford's got enough political power to destroy your career and make sure you never work in law enforcement again." Elena stared out the window at the main street of Copper Ridge, watching ordinary people go about their daily business. Mrs. Chen was sweeping the front steps of her shop. Pedro Martinez was loading vegetables into his cart, preparing for another day of selling produce door to door. Normal folks living normal lives, unaware that their deputy was facing a choice that would define not just her future, but her very soul. "I built my whole life around being strong enough to protect people," she said finally. "But what happens when the law asks you to hurt innocent people? What happens when duty and conscience point in opposite directions?" Wilson leaned back in his chair, studying her face with the shrewd eyes that had seen too much of life's complications. "You're thinking about him, aren't you? The Apache who's been helping folks around here." Elena's head snapped up, her hand instinctively moving toward her gun. "I don't know what you mean." "Easy, deputy," Wilson said with a slight smile. "I've been doing this job for 20 years. I notice things. Supplies disappearing from your saddlebags. Extra medical supplies ordered from the catalog. Long patrols in areas where nothing much happens, followed by you coming back looking different. Peaceful, maybe. Less like you're carrying the weight of the world alone." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It's not what you think." "I think," Wilson said carefully, "that you've found someone who understands the kind of pain you've been carrying. Someone who's helped you remember that strength doesn't always mean standing alone. And I think the territorial government wants to use you to hunt him down like an animal." The accuracy of his observation hit Elena like a physical blow. She buried her face in her hands, trying to organize thoughts that seemed to spin in circles like leaves caught in a dust devil. "What kind of person does that make me?" she asked. "What kind of lawman considers refusing a direct order from the governor?" "The human kind," Wilson replied quietly. "The kind who's learned the difference between justice and vengeance, between law and right. Elena, I've watched you grow into one of the best deputies I've ever worked with. You've got instincts that can't be taught, and integrity that can't be bought. Don't let politicians force you to become something you're not." Elena looked up at him, seeing kindness in his weathered features alongside the respect she'd worked so hard to earn. "If I refuse this assignment, what happens to the people who depend on me here in town? Who protects them if I'm stripped of my badge and run out of the territory? You think you're the only person capable of standing between this town and trouble?" Wilson asked with a gentle smile. "Girl, you've trained half the men in this territory just by showing them what real courage looks like. You've inspired folks to stand up for themselves instead of waiting for someone else to save them. That kind of influence doesn't disappear just because you're not wearing a badge." That evening, Elena rode out to the hidden spring where she'd first learned Kachina's story. She found him there as she'd hoped, tending to a hawk with a damaged wing. The sight of his gentle hands working to heal the injured bird made her heart ache with the impossibility of her situation. "You look troubled," Kachina said without looking up from his work. "Has something happened?" Elena dismounted and settled on her usual stone seat, pulling the telegram from her coat pocket. She handed it to him wordlessly and watched his expression grow grave as he read. "They want to use you against your own people," he said, folding the paper carefully and handing it back. "They want to turn your knowledge and skills into weapons against those who have already lost everything." "I don't know what to do," Elena admitted, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind through the canyon walls. "If I refuse, I lose everything I've worked for. If I accept—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "If you accept, you lose something more important than a career," Kachina said quietly. "You lose the person you've worked so hard to become." Elena looked at him, seeing the pain in his dark eyes that came from understanding exactly what she was facing. "You had to make a similar choice once, when your father demanded you participate in raids against innocent people?" "Yes," Kachina nodded. "And I learned that there are some prices too high to pay, even for family loyalty, even for belonging to something larger than yourself." "But you lost everything," Elena said. "Your family, your tribe, your place in the world. 7 years of exile and loneliness.
How do you know it was worth it?
Kachina finished securing the hawk's wing and gently placed the bird in a makeshift roost where it could rest safely. Then he turned to face Elena fully, his scarred hands steady as he spoke. Because I can still look at myself in the reflection of still water without feeling shame. Because I can tend wounded creatures without wondering if my hands are too stained with innocent blood to bring healing. Because when I choose to help people like Pedro Martinez or Mrs. Chen, I know it comes from love rather than guilt. Elena felt tears threatening, frustrated by the impossible nature of her situation. But what about all the good I could do as a deputy? All the people I could protect? How do I weigh that against this? Elena, Kachina said softly, reaching out to take her hands in his. What good can you do if you build it on a foundation of betraying everything you believe in? What protection can you offer if you compromise the very principles that make your protection worth having? The hawk rustled its feathers and settled more comfortably into its nest, trusting completely in the hands that had tended its injuries. Elena watched the bird and thought about trust, about healing, about the difference between power that came from fear and power that came from love. I'm scared, she said finally. Scared of losing my purpose, my identity. Scared of disappointing people who depend on me. Scared of us. Of what happens if I choose love over duty and it destroys both of us. Kachina lifted one hand to cup her face, his thumb gently brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I'm scared too. Scared that my presence in your life will cost you everything you've worked for. Scared that the world will never accept what we've found together. Scared that loving me will bring you nothing but pain and exile. Then why? Because some things are worth the risk, Kachina said, his voice steady despite the emotion Elena could see in his eyes. Because a life lived in fear of loss is not really living at all. Because the choice to love, to trust, to stand for what we believe is right, that choice defines us more than any title or position ever could. Elena leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his presence even as her mind wrestled with the magnitude of the decision facing her. The governor will make an example of me if I refuse. He'll make sure everyone knows that I chose an Apache outcast over territorial authority. It won't just destroy my career. It'll make me a symbol of everything they fear about the changing West. And if you accept? Kachina asked quietly. If you lead soldiers into the canyons to hunt down people whose only crime is wanting to remain free, what kind of symbol will you become then? Elena closed her eyes, trying to imagine herself in military uniform, leading armed men through the red rock country she'd come to love, tracking people who were probably guilty of nothing more than Kachina's supposed crimes, refusing to surrender, choosing exile over subjugation. I can't do it, she said, the words coming out in a rush of breath and relief. I can't hunt people for the crime of wanting to stay free. I can't use what you've taught me about the desert to trap and capture your people. I won't become the kind of person who builds safety for some by... The morning Elena turned in her badge, half the town gathered in the street to watch. Word had spread quickly about her resignation, though the exact reasons remained a mystery that grew more elaborate with each telling. Some folks said she'd been offered a better position in California. Others claimed she was planning to return east to marry a wealthy businessman her family had arranged. Sheriff Wilson accepted her badge and gun with ceremony that was both respectful and melancholy. You sure about this, Elena? There's still time to reconsider. I could send word to the governor. Tell him you need more time to think about his offer. Elena shook her head, surprised by how light she felt without the familiar weight of the badge on her chest. I'm sure, Sheriff. This is the right choice, even if it doesn't look that way to most people. Wilson studied her face, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. You look different. More peaceful than you've been since I've known you. I guess that's answer enough? Elena cleaned out her desk in the small office that had been her second home for almost a year. There wasn't much to pack. A few personal items, some case files she'd been working on, the photograph of her family that had watched over her through long nights of paperwork and worry. As she prepared to leave, Wilson stopped her at the door. Elena, I want you to know that wearing a badge doesn't make a person a protector. Being willing to stand between innocent folks and harm, that's what makes someone worth following. Badge or no badge, you'll always be that person. The words stayed with Elena as she rode through town for what might be the last time as a resident. People she'd helped over the months waved from doorways and sidewalks. Pedro Martinez tipped his hat with special respect. Mrs. Chen pressed a small package of tea into her hands, speaking rapidly in a mixture of Chinese and Spanish that Elena couldn't follow but understood perfectly. By noon, she'd reached the piece of land near the southern pass that she'd mentioned to Kachina. It wasn't much to look at. 20 acres of rocky ground with a seasonal creek that ran strong in spring but dwindled to pools by midsummer. But it was isolated, beautiful in its stark desert way, and far enough from established settlements that they could build their life without constant scrutiny. Kachina was already there, standing beside a small pile of supplies and studying the lay of the land with the careful attention he brought to everything. The injured hawk perched on his shoulder, its wing healed enough now for short flights but still seeking the security of familiar companionship. "You came," he said simply, though Elena could see relief in his dark eyes. "Did you think I wouldn't?" she asked, dismounting and walking into his arms as naturally as if they'd been greeting each other this way for years. "I hoped," Kachina replied, holding her close. "But hope and certainty are different things. I know what you gave up to be here." Elena looked around at the empty land stretching away toward distant mesas, then back at the man whose quiet strength had taught her new ways to be strong. "I gave up a job. You gave up everything, family, tribe, belonging. If you can build something new from nothing, I figure I can do the same." They spent the afternoon walking the property, discussing practical matters like water rights and building materials, but also sharing dreams about what their life together might look like. Kachina had knowledge of desert farming techniques that could make the land productive. Elena had savings from her deputy work that could buy supplies and livestock. More importantly, they both had skills that would be valuable to the scattered homesteaders and small ranchers in the area. Kachina's medical knowledge was already legendary among those who'd benefited from his anonymous help. Elena's reputation as someone who could track anything and handle herself in dangerous situations would attract people who needed problems solved quietly and efficiently. "We won't be accepted everywhere," Elena said as they sat beside the creek watching the sun sink toward the western horizon. "There will always be people who see us as threats to the natural order." "Yes," Kachina agreed. "But there will also be people who judge us by our actions rather than our appearance or history. People who need help and don't care where it comes from, as long as it's offered with honest intentions." As if summoned by their conversation, a rider appeared on the southern trail, approaching their camp with obvious hesitation. Elena recognized Tom Bradley from the livery stable, a man who'd always treated her with respectful friendliness during her time as deputy. Bradley dismounted and approached their fire with his hat in his hands, clearly uncomfortable but determined. "Miss Rodriguez, Elena, I heard you'd given up your badge and left town. Wasn't sure I'd find you out here." "What can we do for you, Tom?" Elena asked, gesturing for him to sit by their fire. "It's my boy Jimmy," Bradley said, his weathered face creased with worry. "He's been missing for 3 days now. Rode out to check on strays and never came back. Sheriff Wilson's got his hands full with that bank robbery over in Millerville, and I'm not tracker enough to follow Jimmy's trail through the rough country." Elena looked at Kachina, seeing understanding pass between them. This was their first test, the first opportunity to see if their new life could truly work. "We'll find him," Elena said simply. "Do you have something with his scent? A piece of clothing or tack he used recently?" Bradley's relief was visible. His spare shirt and the halter he was using on his horse. "You really think you can track him after 3 days?" "We can try," Kachina said quietly. "The desert keeps its secrets, but it also reveals them to those who know how to ask the right questions." They found Jimmy Bradley the next morning, trapped in a narrow canyon after his horse had been spooked by a rattlesnake and thrown him. The boy had a broken leg and was suffering from exposure, but he was alive and conscious when they reached him. Elena splinted the leg while Kachina prepared herbal remedies to combat fever and dehydration. Working together, they rigged a travois that would allow them to transport Jimmy without causing further injury to his leg. Tom Bradley wept openly when they brought his son back to him, pressing money into their hands despite their protests. "You saved my boy's life," he said simply. "That's worth more than I can ever repay." Word of Jimmy Bradley's rescue spread quickly through the scattered communities of the Southern Territory. Within a week, Elena and Kachina had received 3 more requests for help: a missing person case, a dispute over water rights that needed neutral mediation, and a request from a widow to track down the men who'd stolen her cattle. Each case they took established their reputation as people who could be trusted with problems that required both skill and discretion. Elena's experience with law enforcement and Kachina's knowledge of traditional ways of resolving conflicts proved to be a powerful combination. More importantly, working together revealed new dimensions of their partnership. Elena learned patience from watching Kachina approach problems with methodical care. Kachina discovered that Elena's directness could cut through complications that might otherwise take days to unravel. By spring, they'd built a modest adobe house beside the seasonal creek, with separate rooms for their work and guests who might need shelter. They'd established small gardens using Kachina's knowledge of desert plants and Elena's stubborn determination to make things grow where they shouldn't. The hawk, fully healed now, had chosen to stay with them rather than return completely to the wild. It served as both companion and symbol of what was possible when broken things were given the chance to heal. Their reputation continued to grow throughout the territory. People spoke of the strange partnership between the former deputy and the Apache healer, but they spoke with respect rather than fear. Stories circulated about missing children found, stolen property recovered, disputes settled fairly without recourse to violence. Elena discovered that helping people on their own terms, without the weight of official authority, was more satisfying than anything she'd experienced as a deputy. There was freedom in being able to focus on justice rather than law, on healing rather than punishment. Kachina found that working openly with Elena allowed him to use his skills more effectively than he'd ever been able to do while hiding in the canyons. Together, they could reach people and solve problems that neither could have handled alone. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch of their house watching thunderclouds build over the distant mountains, Elena reflected on how much had changed since that day in the cemetery, when she'd sworn to keep fighting no matter what. "I used to think strength meant never asking for help," she said, leaning against Kachina's shoulder. "Never showing weakness or vulnerability, never letting anyone get close enough to hurt me. And now?" Kachina asked, his arm tightening around her. "Now I think real strength is knowing when to trust someone else with your burdens, knowing when to fight and when to heal, understanding that love doesn't make us weak. It makes us brave enough to care about something more than just our own survival." The first drops of rain began to fall, gentle but persistent, soaking into earth that had been waiting patiently for water. Elena and Kachina moved inside, but left the windows open so they could hear the sound of the storm. That night, as rain drummed on their roof and lightning illuminated the desert, Elena lay in Kachina's arms and thought about the choice that had brought them to